This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Polis Project's weekly dispatches series. On the 14th of August, the Wall Street Journal reported that Aki Das, who's Facebook's top public policy official in India, opposed applying the hate speech rules to BJP's MLA T. Raja Singh, and also other Hindu nationalist individuals and groups. And it's good to remind ourselves that T. Raja Singh is an MLA in Telangana Assembly and who is notorious for making communally charged comments and inciting violence. And the report also said that this was despite the fact that the content posted by these individuals and groups had been flagged internally for promoting violence. And one of the reasons the report says was the fear of ruining the company's relationship with the ruling party. This is not the first time Facebook has been accused and charged with these things. There have been other allegations of how hate speech is going to be moderated on the Facebook platform. There have been other concerns about political ads, and of course, questions about allowing fake news to circulate. Joining us today to discuss the report, but also talk about the larger questions of hate speech, moderation, and also what this means for the public sphere, is Nayandara Raghunathan and Karishma Mehrotra. Nayantara Raghunathan is a researcher and lawyer, and she previously worked for the Internet Democracy Project, where she worked on issues related to freedom of expression, surveillance and net neutrality, and gendered issues of the Internet. She also co founded AdWatch, a project compiling and presenting political ads of Facebook and Instagram. Karishma Mehrotra is an Indian American journalist living in India. She's currently writing for the Indian Express about technology, science, and health in Delhi. She has a master's degree from London SOAS, where she studied media technology and previously worked for the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Boston Globe, and the Atlanta Journal Constitution. Um, Before we start, I kind of want to start by laying out what the report says. Nayantara, can you kind of lay out what the report says and also your initial reactions to the Wall Street Journal report?
Sure. I think you broadly covered it, but essentially the Wall Street Journal report brings attention to Islamophobic content, inciting violence by BJP politicians, and that the public policy head Anki Das kind of influenced some of the takedown decisions to make exceptions for certain BJP politicians, with the logic that it might damage the company's business prospects in the country. The report also notes her own kind of Islamophobic content on her page, as well as the fact that last year during the Indian elections, essentially Facebook took down a number of networks of misinformation, and they also took down pages related to the BJP, but that did not make part of the announcement by Facebook. That was kind of omitted in their announcements. So I guess my main reactions is that this kind of confirms and adds to long-standing concerns, both about the Facebook's relationship with the Hindu right, as well as the problem of Islamophobic content on the platform. And I think many journalists have pointed this out for a long time. A lot of groups have pointed this out. And I think what might be important to understand is the role that Anki Das plays, like the critical role that she plays in a company like Facebook that operates globally, but clueless about social and political contexts in most countries, I mean, often including its own, and the kind of influence and power that Anki Das wields. And of course, the allegations are really serious and merit scrutiny. But I think what is noteworthy is that on the one hand, one of the main vectors of both misinformation as well as hate speech content is the government and government-related actors. So you can't turn to the government for solutions. And on the other hand, Facebook has also been notorious for being disingenuous about its policies, even globally. So I think there's like a normalization of hate on the platforms on the one hand, and a normalization of lack of accountability by Facebook. So what has been good with the report is that it narrates this kind of impasse to, I guess, a broader international audience, and has kicked up a more popular reckoning about Facebook's complicity, which I think kind of breaks that impasse.
Karishma, I was wondering if you could kind of tell us your initial thoughts on this report. Karishma, can you hear me? I don't think Karishma can hear us. Karishma, can you hear me? I don't think Karishma can hear us. Maybe Nayantara, can you kind of go on and talk about? You talked about this idea of transparency and what that means. Can you? Sorry, is Karishma? Can you hear me? I think there's some kind of a problem. All right, Nayantara, do you mind if we go on to the next one? I think we'll wait for
Mhm.
Karishma to come in. Can you talk to us about some of the implications of this report? Now that this report is out, and as you rightly said, a lot of this is issues that people already knew, but this kind of lays things out. What do you think are the implications of this?
Right. Um, well, I think it should have implications for the individuals involved, but more broadly, I think conversations about Facebook's role in spreading hate quickly moves towards discussing Facebook's takedown or content policies, whether something merits being censored or not. But a logical extension of the same question would be like, what merits amplification? You know, like if the censorship is something that is worth understanding, like what kind of content gets taken down, what then it's also important to see what remains, how that circulates, etc. So I think often, as with say misinformation or political ads or most other issues, even with hate speech, I think that the terms of the debate is already set by Facebook in a way that is extremely convenient or more convenient for them. And what might be more important to do is more understand from the point of view of what actually is happening on the platform, how is it being used by the Hindu right, what have been the consequences that we have seen in the last couple of years in the February riots, in the February anti-Muslim violence, and how Facebook and WhatsApp have played a role. And then from there, look at what kind of policies need to exist before quickly moving towards the implementation of those, because clearly that has not worked out. I mean, yeah, maybe I
Karishma,
continue
can you
later.
hear
I
us?
think
Can you hear me?
Karishma's back.
Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Karishma, I was wondering if you could tell us what your initial responses to this report was.
Sure, and I'm sorry if I repeat anything because I went out there for a little bit. But one of the things, so I think there are two different angles to look at that overlap here. One is the political one, and then the other one is obviously the government business relations issue. And like I said, these overlap. So the political issue and political affiliations have been hashed out quite a bit. So I'm particularly interested in the way that public policy roles in technology companies have to manage government business relations, and they're dealing with these huge sort of government regulatory issues, and because of that, what inputs can they make or do they make in content decisions? So some sort of example that or analogy I'd like to give similar to this is if we think about a newspaper like the one I work at, we have a CEO, obviously, and he's in charge of the business. And then I have an editor in chief who's in charge of the editorial. And we'd be fools to say that these two positions don't talk. But in an ideal sort of scenario where I want my readers to trust the news that I'm presenting them, we would like, in the most sort of transparent way, to say that the CEO and the editor in chief are not talking behind the scenes about the things that the government wants and and the government influences on the content. But so I talked to quite a few people in public policy and other, current, former, and all of these tech companies. And this is a debate. I think that some public policy roles think that they should have an influence on what content is presented, how it's presented. Some of them brought up the idea that, in a case like the pandemic, it might not always be a negative thing to have somebody who's a government liaison in content decisions. Others are calling for a very strict line that they're questioning why is it that someone in Anki Das's position is having any say in what content is on or off of the platform. I think one of the productive reflections that I heard of from a former public policy executive was that these processes need to be more formalized within the business. So his point was that often what happens, so let's be clear, like 90%, maybe more, is being algorithmically flagged. And then it goes through a content moderation, these sort of third-party contracted workers who see it. And then you have a certain escalation process that leads to decisions like the ones we hear about in newspapers. So for those decisions, I'm really curious, like, how does that work in a company like Facebook? And you have a content decision team, so maybe they'll call it trust and safety, or something like that. And this team, in somewhat of an informal manner, ropes in legal, they rope in public policy, they're kind of bringing in an input. Maybe it's an email thread, maybe it's conversation in the office. So my question is about those processes and what in that process allegedly allowed someone in a public policy position to have not just her political affiliations, but more so her relations with government, like the business relations with government. And that needs to be put in the context of the threats that companies like Facebook do face in a place like India, where you have pending guidelines for intermediary liability, which would completely change the way Facebook is held liable in this country. You have data localization. Free Basics is a great example of one where they eventually did lose that battle, and Anki Das was there at that time as well. WhatsApp payments is a huge business as aspiration for Facebook, and it's been stuck pretty significantly in India. So these are all things that I know any company in India or any country would have to think about, and that's the role that public policy has. But how does it change when then you're a company that's also dealing with issues of free speech, hate speech, that do influence, like we're talking about, the public sphere? And then we can also talk as well about, political affiliations as well, which is, like you said, it's come up before. So Anki's immediate boss, till most recently, his name was Joel Kaplan, and he came in the news in the US for sitting behind Kavanaugh in the Kavanaugh hearing. So this is not, even in her own hierarchy, like, this has come in the news quite a bit. And then the third thing I wanted to add, something that I had found when I just looked up T. Raja Singh on Facebook, and I was scouring through some of the stuff. And so he has some 7 or 8 different Facebook pages or profiles. And I called him up, spoke to him and his PA, and they're saying, their claim is that we don't publish any of this stuff. This is all our party workers and people who are supporters of us, which, to be fair, I've heard from a lot of political figures about content under their name on the internet. So it should, even as a reporter, it's so hard for me as a reporter to prove that who's publishing this stuff. It says his name, but none of those accounts are verified. And the anonymity and figuring out who should be held responsible, how should they be held responsible. They're complicated decisions, and that's why I like to sort of think about what are the processes that Facebook goes through. And I completely agree that transparency is probably like the biggest issue here. Facebook is, it's difficult to get them to discuss the ways in which, even, let's not talk about specific decisions, let's just talk about the process overall. And that's not been easy to find out. So I agree that transparency is the thing here as well.
Nantara, I quickly want to go in and talk about how the Hindu right uses Facebook. Can you lay that out for us?
Sure. But I think I just want to add a bit to what Karishma just said, that who is publishing those kind of questions. I think that's of course really important in a country where campaign finance laws are weak, and there's like a massive networks of fan pages and other kinds of pages. But then I think it's also important to note that on the one hand, the Facebook gifts political parties or like these kinds of content with impunity in the sense that political, if you are a political actor or like a politician, I guess you can also have all kinds of misinformation, so they don't take that content down as opposed to on other platforms. So I think I find it important to, I don't know, reflect on the question of who is publishing this and how far that takes us, because often, like even with Facebook pushing for authenticity as one of the main pillars of the ways in which it tackles misinformation, I think that is taken us only a certain distance. So I just wanted to say that. And about the Hindu right, I think the reason why this particular story has become so big is because it's a clear-cut case of something that is absolutely unacceptable, even by legal standards, and that's why it's kind of, quite clear as unacceptable by legal standards, by community standards, all of that. But I think if you want to look at how these platforms enable hate, I think we don't have to start with that kind of high threshold. And I think what concerns me more is the way in which a lot of the Hindu right, and I mainly follow the Kannada language groups, and I think that is so much more laden with symbolism, that is so much more about mimetic, and it has memes, posts, the kind that will never make the threshold to be taken down according to these legal standards. So for example, you would have like a derogatory post, like a mildly, a derogatory post about Muslims, and then an encouragement to say, comment what you would like to do to these people. And then there's comments of people, I think it grooms people towards a certain normalization of violence towards certain groups. There's a lot of like, I don't know, like, let's say people are encouraged to participate in the way of uploading images of their kids with saffron gear or like things like that, and they're kind of, they have a sword in one hand and Jai Shri Ram in the other, which to anybody else who, I mean, which even to many Indians who don't feel threatened by this kind of content would not merit being taken down. And that's why I think it's not so useful to look at posts as like these atomic entities that function, that then get like picked up and seen whether this is worth taking down or not. But I think it needs to be looked at in the context of riots happening, where people who have been groomed on these groups for like years and years are then called to the streets. And I think if I can request Varya to just put up maybe the first #1 image, just to show you the kind of, yeah. So this is Kattar Hindutvavadigalige Matra group. It means this group is only for Kattar Hindus. And I think the same kind of translation of the name of this group is also the WhatsApp group on which Delhi riots were organized. Anyway, so you can see that there is basically this has like angry men with orange flags that are being extremely aggressive, which for a lot of people might not inspire fear, but for a lot of people it does. And I think it's like looking at the last couple of months and weeks in Karnataka, where there have been instances or like pivotal moments where some of this online organizing is translating into things on the street. There is a market near my house called, in a place called Vijayanagar, where basically one of the Bajrang Dal activists went and started marking different shops with flags. This, of course, is very reminiscent of the kind of thing that happens before things start to get out of hand, things start to get violent. And there's two ways to look at that. Of course, on the one hand, this was publicized on Facebook. A lot of the organizing happens on Facebook. This guy did Facebook Live when he was going and putting the flags. All of that is fine. But also, if it has disturbed people in the meat space so much to have these markers of violence, these innocuous markers that have come to bear these strong, violent meanings, I think it also has like these symbols and these kind of like milk toast saffron posts on Facebook also creates a certain information atmosphere, which none of Facebook's hate content policies are able to address. And yeah, I guess want, I don't know, we quickly go into implementation of the hate speech policy, but I think there is many steps before that where people are trying to understand these groups, and it needs an avowed commitment to handling a very specific kind of playbook of violence. And I think people are doing that. Groups across, in many parts of the country are doing that. And they've particularly flagged these issues to Facebook, and it hasn't been taken down, but I think it goes beyond the takedowns.
I just have an audience question via email that says, how much of this is, sorry, let me rephrase it. The audience question is that how much of this refusal to remove, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So the audience questions is that how much of this is a refusal to understand what's happening in India? How much of this is plain bigotry? On the brackets, it says bigotry or political and ideological affiliations of those who work for Facebook. And how much of this is just about making money with India as a market? So that was a question. I was wondering if both Karishma and Nandara can respond to it. Karishma, would you want to take it first and then we can go to Nandara?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can say that, it's a certain percentage of this or a certain percentage of this. I did start out by saying I think that both the politics and the business of this, they overlap right together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are, I think they coexist. I don't think there's a how much of this. I mean, no one's fooling themselves that money is not in, business is not a consideration. And that's why I brought up the public policy aspect of this. And I also wanted to bounce off what Nayantara was saying about the groups and focusing on how that network is built, just to show how complicated it was. I remember during the elections going and speaking to some of the social media offices, especially these very small scale offices in like Western UP, and just seeing how their WhatsApp groups function from the official channels. And so each of these, each booth, each region, it has this very sort of set hierarchy of, the BJP or Congress or whatever party IT cell sort of moving down into these other groups. So you'll have like a nodal person in each level of hierarchy that will disseminate the information further. But what happens is when you go further and further down and you get to the pure volunteer, social media volunteer level, where it's just people who, I remember one person said that at least I can give my data to my country. That's the least that I can do. So they're also sending content up the channel. So it's working both ways. So it's I saw this very amorphous nature in which official channels and unofficial channels merged. So I just wanted to say that about the organizational way in which political content sort of trickles down these like groups all the way to the booth level. But yeah, you can take up the other question as well, Nandara.
I guess my response to the question is just that it's entirely business logic, and of course that is political too. And so, for example, I think this, if it weren't if all decisions did not come with the umbrella of the business logic, there would be Facebook would engage with the fact that extremist content, more affective, more violent or emotion stimulating stuff gets more engagement. What I'm trying to say is, say the ask of the transparency of the newsfeed algorithm, which could be considered one of Facebook's main kind of offerings, would be not a problem if they weren't driven by their business imperatives. You would not have political advertising transparency where the amount of money spent for each ad, it would not be a broad range that is almost useless. You would have a specific number. I think all decisions totally are, I think, definitely driven by a business sense. And of course, Facebook is being twisted because of its implications also for like politics in different parts of the world. But I think those are kind of consolatory things that Facebook is doing, if that answers the question.
We are taking audience questions, and I'm just going to read out an audience comment. This is from Radhika Kajoria. She said, "Great discussion. What is happening is very scary. It is part of a larger narrative playing out on the ground. This legitimizes violence, and we have seen on the ground violence in Delhi and other cities." We have another question that says, "The report." Sorry, 1 minute. The report. In the report, it felt like Akidas was not only Akidas was not only pushed by business, but also it felt like these were ideological foot soldiers. Is that something that you disagree? Because Congress also has money. Congress could also spend. Congress here means the Congress party, which is the other party in India, also has money to spend. And why was the Congress pages removed? Would any of you like to take this question about political affiliation again? It's interesting that political and ideological affiliation questions keep coming up.
I mean, I guess one thing is, of course, the BJP was in power last year. But of course, I think beyond that also, there has been, I think as a company, face a lot of advertising products, a lot of what Facebook has to offer is very platform specific. So like part of WhatsApp's very obvious business job is to go and think of politicians as clients, which they are because they do spend large amounts of money on these platforms, and explain to them specifically how to use their platforms. Because your whole content creation and communications for an entire election, big part of your budget is oriented towards putting it on these social media platforms. So everything from making your content to the size that is perfect for Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, to understanding how do these products work in terms of how does the optimization work, all of that. I think an entire industry of like digital marketing is oriented towards understanding like 3 platforms. So shit, I forgot my point. Sorry. I think I was trying to say that that yes, of course, they would also go to different kinds of political parties. I think people like Cyril Sam have written about how Facebook worked closely with many political parties in the early 2010s, like that decade, and kind of coached people, like both made parties appreciate the value of these platforms as well as coached them very closely. And this is also the case with the US and many other places in the world, that you closely work with parties in order to help them use your platform. So it does happen across platforms, but I imagine that there were closer affiliations that happen for particular reasons. And you can also see that in the way that BJP used Facebook ads in 2019. You see that their content is like, for my first vote for Modi page, which was oriented towards, of course, like 18 to 20-year-olds, I guess, who were voting for the first time. The content was all about, you get like these 2 girls sitting in their dorm room, one of them talking to their boyfriend, and like the other one says, oh, I have free data now. And it's all very like young and like whatever, chill, but the exact kind of content is also like being, I mean, different kinds of content by the same company is also being created for like older folk, which is totally about, we will make a Ram Mandir. And the same thing is being like made in different languages and targeted to different parts of the country according to which dubbed version is for whom. And then you look at Congress ads, which is so bad, like even for, I don't know if we have to use them in some kind of, in the project that I work on called AdWatch with my colleague Manuel Beltran. When we have to use some of these images, like they're bad even to use them as like, putting it on a screen. So clearly BJP is getting a lot of things right with their digital strategy. And part of the reason might be because they work closely with some of these platforms, maybe not, but that's how it is.
I know we have a lot of audience questions coming in, but I'm going to go into the next core theme that we wanted to discuss, which is how do we understand the infrastructures of political propaganda that is
Can you
built
hear
on
me?
Facebook? Yes, I can hear you. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, really want to understand if you can, if both Karishma, maybe you can go first. How would you deconstruct this infrastructure that's been built just for the purpose of political propaganda? I think we've lost Karishma again. Nayantara, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think she's back. I feel I've been speaking for too long, so maybe.
Yeah, maybe we
Okay.
can.
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me?
It's okay. Karishma, I kind of wanted to go into how the infrastructures of political propaganda work, and if you can kind of deconstruct it for us.
Okay, I mean, I can't handle that entire topic, but I'll discuss some points that I've looked at and thought about. So one aspect to look at is just paid advertising, right? And that's just the top of what we can see. But Facebook has put out this ad archive, which I remember during elections, I crawled through. So to be fair, it was a great resource for journalists, that ad archive. So I found that the BJP was spending 21 crore on Facebook and Google. The Congress was 4.5 crore. But when you look at the pages, if you go through the different pages that are spending a certain amount of money, a lot of them are not labeled or linked to the BJP at all, but it's very clearly pro-BJP content. That was the case for Congress as well, but much less. So I saw that more than half of the pages that were spending in the top brackets were not being labeled as a political party. And My Nation with Namo, or you mentioned My First Vote with Modi, both of those, My First Vote with Modi, Nation with Namo, Man Ki Baat, these are certain pages that had a lot of spending on Facebook and were labeled community groups or something of that sort. So that kind of is one layer that we can look at to see into this. The other that I've been interested in, it doesn't intersect as well with Facebook or Twitter, but I think it's really important. I think that a lot of people miss maybe how important it was. Is even outside of social media, BJP was doing a lot of work with data. And there's a huge rise of these political consultancies in India, especially those who are very digitally focused or data analysis focused. So two names that I reported on, one was Jarvis, and the other one is Association for Billion Minds. So Jarvis in particular, and if we remember the missed call campaigns, those started way back 2013. But imagine if those campaigns were starting in 2013, and they've just accumulated, phone numbers over time. I had spoken at that time during elections to someone who told me that they had a 25 crore strong database of phone numbers linked to the booth level, and many of those linked to beneficiary schemes. So this is something that I was also very interested in, is the way that they used phone numbers and data and linked it to beneficiaries and linked it to party workers. And so this was a whole nother layer to their outreach. And I think the reason I bring that up is because we have to keep in mind half of the population of this country is not on social media or the internet. And there was this really interesting study, although I'd like to see more research about this, by the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, CSDS. They came out to say, the BJP's vote share actually reduced among social media users since 2014. And the study's very clear premise was that we shouldn't overestimate the ability of social media to affect elections, but that doesn't mean it doesn't affect elections. It sort of cautions us to think that it's the reason why a certain political agenda might be winning. So I think those are two things I think about with political propaganda, that it can exist outside of social media as well, and it does. That doesn't mean it doesn't also exist in social media, but there are many different levers that are being pulled and used at the same time. And I think we should focus on a lot of them, especially the way that they use data, I think, in general, outside of Facebook.
Karishma, I just had a follow-up question. So when you said 25 crore numbers, is it just numbers or is it 25 crore people? Is it numbers or people? I just want to phone numbers or the people.
Phone numbers. Those were
Phone
phone
numbers.
numbers. Yeah,
Okay.
those were phone numbers that they mapped to beneficiary schemes to the polling booth, and then mapped party workers to those numbers.
Wow. Okay. Nayantara?
Right. I think I totally agree with Karishma that social media also acts in conjunction with other kinds of media. And I think one of the main ways that happens is the way that TV debates are influenced by whatever is trending or like on social media. And of course, there is limited amount of attention that people have. So what is newsworthy becomes what is like some silly thing that might be trending on social media. So I think, of course, it works in very weaved in ways. But I think with the one point that I want to make about infrastructures of political propaganda is I think, again, I come back to my point that a lot of like all these debates, hate speech, misinformation, political ads, all of them with transparency as the poster solution hides more than it reveals. And what I mean with that is like with hate speech, takedowns are not good enough. They're only handling a particular part of the problem, and that also not very well. Fact checks do not work with misinformation. Like you have like Yogi Adityanath saying Modi gave the biggest relief package of coronavirus across the world. Immediately you have like 10 fact checks, blah blah, things get taken down. None of it matters. I think the way that misinformation works, a lot of people are studying it and pointing these things out, but fact checks don't help. And with political ads also, I feel like this framework of political ads essentially hides the whole world of ads that is not tagged as political. Now, what is political ads? Political ads is what Facebook considers related to related to social issues, politics, or elections. I think that's the phrase. So you have like politicians who are self-professed politicians with these verified pages, but you also have like issue ads, like for example, abortion in Ireland, in the US, or like I don't know, maybe like stuff related to beef in India or things like that. So you also have what is called the issue ads. Now, one might think that the fact that the reach of any post at all is determined by an unknowable number of factors makes everything political, if not even otherwise. The fact that what is political is not like a list of items. Then you kind of begin to scratch the surface of like all the things that might not be considered political at all. And when we're talking about like these kinds of networks of like business networks of politicians, of like undisclosed amounts of money, campaign funding coming from different places. All of this means that what is important more than ever is to understand paid reach on the whole, and not just like what is considered political, like a very simplistic understanding of what is considered political ads. So what the framework of political ads does as a category is, of course, it's an unstable category. So every time someone points something out, Facebook is happy to put that in. There is like climate crisis debates happening in the world. Okay, sure, suddenly like business ads become political because they have the word sustainability in them. But otherwise, like if you're selling something that is not so like overtly related to what Facebook considered politics, then it's totally invisible. So I think there is I think my main issue with this infrastructure of political propaganda of Facebook, as of other social media platforms, because they're all kind of coming together to have this like ceiling through self-regulation of something called political ads that I don't think anyone necessarily agreed to. Like, do we agree that only certain things are political among content? And do we agree that it is the list of items that Facebook provides? I don't think so. I don't think there's consensus on that.
So we have a bunch of audience questions, all coming around the questions of regulation. So I'm just going to list both of them because they kind of overlap. First is, given the intricate nexus at play with the hate narrative often being misogynist, what are the ways in which we can be safe? What safeguards can we take? So one is about what's individual safeguards. So what can individuals do? And the second question is about a larger monitoring thing, which says, can the Supreme Court appoint an independent committee of regulation of social media operations and advertisements, just like it had formed the Loda Committee for the BCCI? So one is about individual responsibility, and second is about a larger institutional responsibility.
So institutionally, I mean, there are a couple places where we can look at to see attempts. So the Election Commission tried to adapt during this election. They formed a committee to study the impact of social media on the model code of how it pits against the model code of conduct. And they were giving out takedown notices, and they did come together with an agreement with the tech companies. Now it's debatable how much, the Election Commission was able to do and how much that attempt worked. But I think that's one place we've seen some amount of attempt to have an oversight. The other is internally within Facebook. They're setting up their oversight board as well, which is being dubbed as a sort of Supreme Court. And so while a lot of hate speech and misinformation and a lot of political figures' speech will go to that board, and they're trying, they've laid out a method in which they think it's independent. It won't address speech that stays up there. So that actually, I think, sort of misses along. Did I cut out there? Can you hear me?
Yes, you can. This is just a few seconds. Please go on.
Okay. So I think those are things we can look at. But, this is something that I think countries all around the world are trying to figure out on an institutional level, is how to legally address this changing media. And I think you have different methods. So if we look at India alone, the intermediary liability rules that came out were a huge sort of attempt to do this. They haven't made any progress since then.
Karishma, can you hear us? Yeah.
Hello?
Karishma, yeah, you can. Yeah, please go on. I think you just froze for a few seconds. Please go on. Karishma, can you hear us? Karishma, can you hear us? Nathar, do you want to kind of, would you like to start?
Sure. Maybe I want to respond to this question on individual responsibility. I feel like that's what platforms like Facebook would love for you to do and think. Their main responses to any kind of lack of like online abuse or whatever is to control what you share, like that you take all of these measures. But what you never understand from them is what gets shared, like why does something particular get shared on someone's, why is a particular post number 3 on my timeline and number 8 on someone else's, and what gets shared as a collective decision by the algorithm is not understood, but they're very happy for you to control what you share. And likewise, I think you can individually opt out of receiving political ads, and that's all fine. But what you're not able to understand is, I think with the project I work with called AdWatch, we really like this example and talk about it a lot, that if you're looking with a friend at a billboard, you're able to understand what is being said, and in a way you can disagree, you can kind of cringe, hate it, agree, whatever, and you move on. But with political ads, often I have no idea what someone else is receiving. And it's not just about the content of it, but also like why I received a particular ad when I was in the Vijayanagar market as opposed to when I was in some supermarket, like the reasons also behind why you receive what you receive. So I would say that I'm sure there's a bunch of individual solutions that we can all think of and come up with to be more safe, but I don't think that that helps most of us. And I think the question of independent committees, I would be really unsure because like there was an instance of violence that happened on the 11th of August in Bangalore that was triggered by a Facebook post. In the aftermath of it, during it, all the time, there was like massive amounts of misinformation, propaganda, hate speech, all of that happening in relation to that violence. That violence involved a couple of people who reacted to a particular post against a religious, I mean, it was against the Prophet Muhammad, and it like these folks went and went to the police station of two particular places and to this politician's house and burnt a couple of things. So basically, it has been blown into a totally different thing. And there has been an independent fact-finding committee, like so-called independent one that is set up, which is full of like people that are happy to jump on the propaganda van. And of course, there is, in reaction to that, also like a civil society-led fact-finding group that has come together. So what I'm trying to say is, I don't know, like in light of what we see happening with the Supreme Court, in light of what is happening across the country with different kinds of supposedly independent committees, I don't feel that is exactly what we need, like something appointed by the government. Instead, I think what groups like Equality Labs, Internet Freedom Foundation, a bunch of people are asking for is to have like a third-party audit. So not necessarily government appointed, but something that in the eyes of international and national observers is a legitimate kind of body that is conversant with and understands how minorities feel today and are able to understand Facebook's policies in light of that.
Karishma, you got cut out on the time when you're talking about accountability. So yeah, sorry. Do you want to finish that and then we could go on to the other questions?
The only thing I was saying was that was Facebook's response to this conversation that's been happening for a long time, but that wouldn't even address a lot of what we're talking about here because it wouldn't address content that is left up on the platform. It only isn't. It's an appeals process for content that's taken down, and so I think, I mean, it's true that we haven't solved this issue. I think I look at it as a huge battle between you have government and company, and as an individual, I'm sort of looking at both of these, and I don't know who to trust. I don't know who should be holding who accountable, and there are instances where tech companies are standing up against governments for human rights issues and vice versa, and so I don't have a solution, unfortunately. I mean, and that's such an awful cop-out, but I don't think I know the best way to do this. I think one potential, if we're looking at a more micro level at this specific thing, I think all the tech companies could do well by having very formulaic processes through which content decisions are made at the local and global level, that they lay out for the audience that, okay, if a content moderator escalates something to my local India office, this is the team that's looking at it. This is the team that they're bringing in. This is the committee that's looking at it. This is when they talk to global. So at least giving us a sense of, what exactly is the process. I think that's just the first step that we have to work with. I mean, it's so hard to find a solution to something that we don't even know what's going on half the time. So I maybe that's my reporter answer, that I just want more, more answers, more understanding of how the process works.
We're already on our 15-minute mark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to address the last question also as a way for both of you to give your concluding remarks. What we've really seen is that platforms like Facebook now adversely affect public narratives, which in turn affect crucial public policy decisions and even elections. We saw this play out in Indian elections. I was wondering if you could kind of lay out not only the power that these things have, but ways for us to think about it. And I think what I'm really interested in, how do we think about it beyond the narratives of, yes, Facebook is influencing these democratic processes, but how else can we rethink this and this very particular moment?
Ninta, you want to start?
Sure.
Nainthara, we also have a question that's directly put to you. Says, given that institutional failures, what are the international legal instruments that we can use to hold Indian government accountable? Perhaps kind of fold that into the larger question as well.
I don't know about international legal instruments being useful either. I'm sorry, but I just think it's hopeful, that this report is starting a conversation across the world. People are being aghast at what is happening, and I think that is important. And since there is how do you call it, precedent with what happened in Myanmar, and there is precedent with like Facebook admitting to its complicity in the genocide, I think we can use that kind of public opinion. I'm not so sure about institutional routes that could be helpful at this point. And to Suchitra's question, I guess a natural reaction to a lot of these things has been lately to look towards Indian companies, because of course there is like this super clueless company which has has no context about the cultural context here, and tries to and then relies on Ankita so deeply to translate it for them. So quickly the answer becomes, okay, then we go vocal for local. But I think the problem is that across platforms we're seeing that this kind of content is that it sells and that it moves. And I think so I don't know like what to say to wrap up, except that I think a lot of technological infrastructures or technology is being really co-opted in this project of in fascism, and in like more ways than one, and by more platforms than one. Not just in like extremely direct and obvious ways as in this case, but also in like more devious or like more invisible ways. And I would just say that's something to keep in mind, because it's also often a very seductive kind of proposition to use like AI to solve I don't know, policing issues and things like that. So that's all.
Nayanthara, I have another question that's being directly put to you. It's Sarfaraz. He says, this report hasn't been covered in the Indian mainstream media as much for obvious reasons. Are you aware of groups pursuing this report for accountability purposes? Sorry, I know we're towards the end.
I think Karishma is, no? Karishma is following it. So I think we go to the report.
So the question is directed to you.
So yeah, do you, Karishma? I mean, I'm kind of going to rephrase it. I'm sorry. I know we are in the last segment of it, and we just have a lot of questions coming in. I know you've been reporting on this, but as a reporter, do you feel that this has not been covered as much in the mainstream Indian news media? I'm just was hoping if you could comment on that.
My answer to that is I think technology is not covered enough in general in the mainstream media. I think that it's a very, it's a topic that only now are we starting to see proper beats being made out of it within the newspapers. So I think overall, every aspect of technology, if you pick anything, I think that we're not covering it enough. Yeah, so that's, and I only know my newspaper. I've not worked anywhere else in India, unfortunately. But just to throw in a little bit more pieces that maybe I wasn't able to touch upon as much. One, I think, is the next hate speech and discussions about hate speech have been going on since 2013, and I often look to places like Europe because they've been talking about this stuff way earlier than all of us. So, you know, Germany called this out in 2013. They recently passed a hate speech law, but Europe and the US have been talking a lot more about competition law and antitrust law, and different ways in which and this is a question, I think this is something that should be intersected in this conversation of if these companies were smaller or if they didn't have such a dominance, what would that look like? And I think that as a citizen, when I look at my digital public sphere, I often have to choose between, like I said, the government or the company. And we don't seem to have both technological and legal solutions that give me more power in my own public sphere.
I think Karishma's having tech issues again.
I think every time I talk, that's when my computer starts to heat up. Can you hear me?
Yeah, no, I can hear you. I feel like I feel like even the computer is tone policing women now. You know, it's
Hello?
like, yeah, I can hear you. Yes, please. Karishma, we can hear you. Please go ahead. I'm just saying, yeah. Maybe just give it a minute. It's not.
I'm so sorry. I think every time I talk is when my computer heats up. It must be so angry about everything I'm saying.
No, I was just saying that even the computer is tone policing women in public.
Yes,
Yeah.
the computer does not want me to have this conversation.
Yeah, Karishma, please finish your thoughts. And
yeah, I was just finishing to say, what would that look like if, you know, our algorithms, we had more control over what sort of speech I could see or what sort of platform I wanted to enter into? And would that then sort of splinter off the internet too much? But would that give me more control to say, like, I don't want this speech, or is it partly the algorithm that, because it keeps feeding me back information that I want to see, is that part of the issue? So these, I think, questions that I ask about if the companies weren't the size that they were, what would that look like? And if the algorithms were more under my control, if I could control more of what I'm seeing, what would that look like as well?
Nayantara, Karishma, thank you so much for joining us. We'll have more of their work, Karishma's work, Nayantara's work, tagged in our Twitter thread. Please do engage with the work that both of them have done. And again, thank you for all of us for joining us. And also apologies, we have another 8 questions that we haven't been able to put to Karishma and Nayantara because we're running out of time. But I hope to have more of these conversations. And again, if you like the work that we do, please consider supporting the Polis Project via Patreon. Thank you, Karishma. Thank you, Nayantara.
Thank you. Thank you.